I'm James Reidner with Three Measures Ministry. Thank you for joining me for our gospel teaching, Three Measures of Good News. This is part 3 in the series, so it goes without saying, if you haven't seen part 1 or 2, you're going to want to do that before you get to part 3, and it will be the same as we get into further parts throughout this series. We're just going to keep building and building and building. So in part 3, we're looking at the problem. We're looking at the bad news of the kingdom. And we saw, starting off in part 2, this idea that this promise that Yahweh made to Abraham, that he actually proclaimed to Abraham. We referenced Galatians chapter 3, how the gospel, the good news, was proclaimed beforehand to Abraham. We took a look at the details on exactly what that was. And we saw that it was a land promise and a descendant promise, and that both aspects of that were to be everlasting covenantally. And we saw that Yahweh made that promise by himself, and since he can't die, this is going to happen. Now, this was put on hold. When the people were down in Egypt at all that time, obviously they were not in the land, they were not possessing it. We're going to see, as we get into part 3 here, that problem is going to expand. But before we get there, we're going to summarize a little bit of history real quick. We know that after the Exodus, the Israelites went into the land under Joshua, they conquered it, and for a good long while, they lived there. We saw the time of the judges come and go. We got into Samuel. We got into Saul, David, Solomon. And as we progressed up to King Solomon, we saw the kingdom become a united kingdom. We saw it be a nation of one king. We saw the people have one central area of worship, and everything was running pretty smoothly. If you factor out all of the bloodshed and the war and all the political drama and all of that stuff. But it was a kingdom. It was a kingdom in every aspect of the word. A kingdom needs 4 things to be a kingdom. It needs a king, obviously. It needs land. It needs laws. And it needs a people. And at that time, it had all of the above. So what we're going to see, though, is that as we go through here, we're going to see that come to an end. And as we get into Leviticus 26 here, we're going to see the setup for how that's going to happen. We're going to see Yahweh, as he goes through his blessings and curses here in Leviticus 26, we're going to see that part of the cursing is the removal of Israel from the land. Let's start reading in verse 27. Yet if in spite of this you do not obey me, but act with hostility against me, then I will act with wrathful hostility against you, and I, even I, will punish you 7 times for your sins. Further, you will eat the flesh of your sons, and the flesh of your daughters you will eat. I then will destroy your high places, and cut down your incense altars, and heap your remains on the remains of your idols. For my soul shall abhor you. I will lay waste your cities as well, and I will make your sanctuaries desolate, and I will not smell your soothing aromas. I will make the land desolate, so that your enemies who settle in it will be appalled over it. You, however, I will scatter among the nations, and I will draw out a sword after you, as your land becomes desolate and your cities become waste. So he's going to remove the people out of the land and scatter them. Verse 34, Then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths all the days of the desolation while you are in your enemy's land. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it will observe the rest which it did not observe on your Sabbaths while you were living on it. As for those of you who may be left, I will also bring weakness into their hearts in the lands of their enemies, and the sound of a driven leaf will chase them. And even when no one is pursuing, they will flee as though from the sword, and they will fall. They will therefore stumble over each other as if running from the sword, although no one is pursuing. And you will have no strength to stand up before your enemies. But you will perish among the nations. In other words, not in the promised land. And your enemy's land will consume you. So those of you who may be left will rot away because of their iniquity in the lands of your enemies, and also because of the iniquities of their forefathers, they will rot away with them. If they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their forefathers in their unfaithfulness which they committed against me, and also in their acting with hostility against me, I also was acting with hostility against them, to bring them into the land of their enemies, or if their uncircumcised heart becomes humbled so that they then make amends for their iniquity, I then will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember also my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham as well, and I will remember the land. For the land will be abandoned by them, and it will make up for its Sabbaths while it is made desolate without them. They, meanwhile, will be making amends for their iniquity, because they rejected my ordinances, and their soul abhorred my statutes. Yet in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them, nor will I so abhor them as to destroy them, breaking my covenant with them. For I am Yahweh their God. But I will remember for them the covenant with their ancestors, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am Yahweh. So he's saying that they're going to radically fall off the wagon. And when this happens, they're going to be expelled from the land. And they're going to die in the land. Outside the land. But because he made this covenant, that's not going to be the permanent situation. Because if it was, that would mean he broke his covenant to Abraham and the other patriarchs. So to keep the covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, there has to be some way for this problem to be reconciled. Let's go to 1 Kings. We're going to see where this division actually happens. Now, I mentioned that the kingdom had been seeing a gradual unification starting under King Saul, going up through King David and then into King Solomon. Now we're going to see that start to falter. 1 Kings 11, we'll read verse 9 through 13. Now Yahweh was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from Yahweh, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. And of course, me thinking, if Yahweh appears to you twice, how do you turn away from him? We have to be mindful of our fleshly failings here. Verse 10, and he had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what Yahweh had commanded. So Yahweh said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and I will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in the days of Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So he's talking about here, because of Solomon's idolatry, all that wisdom and all that knowledge, Yahweh had appeared to him twice, and even with all of that, he still rebelled against Yahweh and went into idolatry. And he led the people that way too. And because of this, the kingdom's going to be removed, and he's going to give part of it to a servant of Solomon. This is the beginnings of the bad news of the kingdom. Now here's a map. This is what this looks like. You can see in the bottom, in the orange, that's Judea, that's the southern kingdom. And at the top, that's Samaria. We know that after Solomon's death, the kingdom of Israel was split in two. That blue there, that's the northern 10 tribes. They broke away under the reign of Jeroboam. And the orange is the southern tribes. They remain loyal to Solomon's son Rehoboam. And so going forward in the scriptures, we see the northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah. We'll also see, you can see there on that map, Samaria. Sometimes the northern kingdom is called Samaria. That was its capital. Sometimes you'll see it called the house of Israel. Sometimes you'll see the southern kingdom called the house of Judah. Same basic idea. 2 Kings, let's read 17, verse 7 through 18. Now the bad news is going to get even worse. Now this came about, we'll see what this is here in a second, because the sons of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And they had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom Yahweh had driven out before the sons of Israel, and in the customs of the kings of Israel which they had introduced. The sons of Israel did things secretly which were not right against Yahweh their God. Moreover, they built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set for themselves sacred pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree, and there they burned incense on all the high places, as the nations did, which Yahweh had carried away to exile before them. And they did evil things, provoking Yahweh. They served idols, concerning which Yahweh had said to them, you shall not do this thing. Yet Yahweh warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you through my servants the prophets. However, they did not listen, but stiffened their neck like their fathers who did not believe in Yahweh their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant which he had made with their fathers, and his warnings with which he had warned them. And they followed vanity and became vain, and went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which Yahweh commanded them not to do like them. They forsook all the commandments of Yahweh their God, and made for themselves molten images, even 2 calves, and made an Asherah, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. Then they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire, and practiced divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him. So Yahweh was very angry with Israel, and removed them from his sight. None was left except the tribe of Judah. Now what he's talking about here, this is the northern kingdom being carried away into captivity by Assyria. This is about 720, 721 BC. This is people being actually removed from the land. So we just talked about the idea that the kingdom was being split. This once unified kingdom was being split in 2, but at least they were still in the land. Now that northern kingdom, the blue section in that map we looked at earlier, is being removed from the land altogether. Here's a map of what that looks like. You can see down at the bottom left there, Samaria in that kind of darker orange, and then we get up into the green. The green is the Assyrian Empire at the time. And we can see these are areas that are mentioned in the scriptures, and so we know where these people were taken to specifically. And so obviously, if you're out in these green areas, you're not in the promised land. So this is the beginning, the further, I shouldn't really say beginning, it began a while back, but this is even further unraveling of the kingdom. This is more bad news, and it's just going to get worse. Let's read in 2 Kings, chapter 24, verse 1 through 4. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Jehoiakim was the king of Judah, the southern kingdom at the time. Then he turned and rebelled against him. Yahweh sent against him bands of Chaldeans, bands of Arameans, bands of Moabites, and bands of Ammonites. So he sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of Yahweh, which he had spoken through his servants, the prophets. Now, we had read some of that back in Leviticus 26. That was a prophecy. What we haven't read yet is all of these other prophets coming along, like Hosea and Amos and Jeremiah, all these other prophets coming along and telling everybody, you guys are going to get removed from the land if you don't turn back to the covenant. And Yahweh's following through with exactly what he said he was going to do here. Verse 3, surely at the command of Yahweh it came upon Judah to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also for the innocent blood which he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and Yahweh would not forgive. Manasseh was one of the kings of Judah a few kings back. Anyway, so here we have the idea that not only was the northern kingdom taken captive, now the southern kingdom is on its way out too. Let's keep reading in chapter 24, starting in verse 10. At that time the servants of Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon went up to Jerusalem, and the city became under siege. And Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon came to the city, while the servants were besieging it. Jehoiakim the king of Judah went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother, and his servants, and his captains, and his officials. So the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. He carried out from there all the treasures of the house of Yahweh, and all the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon king of Israel had made in the temple of Yahweh, just as Yahweh had said. So this is obviously not good news. Then he led away into exile all Jerusalem, and all the captains and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. Definitely not good news. This is a kingdom in shambles. This is not the type of kingdom that was promised to Abraham. Abraham was promised that his descendants, along with himself, would inhabit and possess this land forever. And everybody's being taken out of the land at this point, except for just a few poor farmers. And so this is definitely not good news. Definitely not good news. Nehemiah. We'll conclude this part in Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is post-exilic, and when we say that, we mean after the 40-ish year time when Jerusalem had been sacked by Nebuchadnezzar, which we just read about. The people are in captivity in Babylon, and they are allowed by the Persian Empire, which superseded Babylon, to come back into the land. So Nehemiah is reflecting on that here. We'll read the first chapter of Nehemiah. The words of Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital, so he's in Persia, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity, and about Jerusalem. They said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. I said, I beseech you, O Yahweh, God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now, day and night, on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we have sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, nor your statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, and I will scatter you among the peoples, which we just demonstrated how that happened, but if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote part of the heavens, I will gather them from there and will bring them to the place where I have chosen to cause my name to dwell. They are your servants and your people whom you redeem by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight to revere your name, and make your servant successful today and grant him compassion before this man. And so what we have here is Nehemiah is actually invoking the covenant. He knows that Yahweh has to fulfill the covenant. And when we see this unconditional covenant being made, we know it's going to happen. But the big variable is us. Our behavior is determining when this is actually going to happen, when it's going to be totally fulfilled. And so Nehemiah is appealing to Yahweh to actually fulfill his covenant. And as part of his little monologue here, he's repenting. He's acknowledging the sins of the people. And this is part of what is necessary in order for the people to be reconciled back to Yahweh's own heart and for him to actually be able to fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham. So this is the end of part 3 here. We took a look at the bad news of the kingdom. There's a lot of bad news we could have read through. I limited it to these select scriptures just to make the point and set the stage for what's coming. In the next part, part 4, we're going to take a look at the words of the prophets. The prophets are going to tell us what the solution is. How is this bad news of the kingdom going to be turned into good news? We're going to take a look at that in part 4. I hope you'll join me then. This is James Ryder with 3 Measures Ministry.